This level of destruction is not something you really appreciate until you go there. When you enter Gaza, it's an apocalyptic scene. So that's why a lot of these injuries, too, for example, brain injuries or open head injuries, they're deemed to be unsalvageable because the rates of infection are so incredibly high that even if you did try to save it, it would be seen as like a waste of resources. But at what point do you just get scared into being silent? I can't do it. And something I mentioned in my article is I will use every energy, every ounce of energy in my body to speak out against this. And I will not be silenced. I will not be scared into being silent because the things that I have to say and the things that I witnessed and my colleagues witnessed are standalone statements. It's gotten global attention, and I think our voices together have become louder. And me of all people, because I feel so helpless at times, I feel that even though it seems futile at times, I think we have made a movement. When people go out into the streets and protest, when people speak up and continue to speak up for this and say that it's wrong despite trying to be silenced, I think it sets the tone for other people to be able to speak up.
Welcome to the FloodGate podcast, brought to you by the Palestine Chronicle. We are here to engage with today's most pressing issues and unpack them beyond the cliches of mainstream media. I'm your host, Romana Rubeo. Today, I have the pleasure of co-hosting this vital conversation with Dr. Omar Akhter. Dr. Omar is an internal medicine physician practicing in Austin, Texas. He raises awareness about the Palestinian struggle through his podcast, Save the Olive Tree, which can be found on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. Thank you so much, Omar, for being with us.
Thank you, Romana. Today's guest is Dr. Mimi Syed, an American board-certified emergency medicine physician. She served in Gaza from August 8th to September 5th, 2024, and again from December 3rd to December 31st, 2024, working both at Al-Aqsa Hospital and Nasser Hospital. In addition to her frontline medical work, Dr. Syed has written numerous articles for the Palestine Chronicle and given multiple interviews to denounce the atrocities she witnessed. Through her testimony, she has courageously exposed the crimes committed against Palestinian civilians, especially children, during the ongoing genocide in Gaza.
Thank you so much for taking the time, Dr. Syed, and welcome to the FloodGate podcast. So let's begin at the very heart of your experience. What was for you the pivotal moment, like the core motivation that compelled you to travel to Gaza in the first place?
I get asked that question quite often, and I think I was among many people. I was looking at what was happening in Gaza on live stream on social media, and I have to admit, embarrassingly, I didn't know much about the history and the political atmosphere at the time. I thought, okay, this is just this is highly conflicted area. It will go away. It'll stop eventually. But I just after October 7th, I just kept seeing images and images, and it'd been months. And what I noticed was children, small children, over and over again, and disproportionately so. And I would see various things, in the hospital, scenes from the hospital, and then started to understand that most of the senior staff had been either killed or imprisoned. And I felt a duty not only as a physician to show up, but also as a mother of 3 small children. I know that if I was a mother in Gaza, I wouldn't want the world to turn their back on me, and I would want all the help from the entire global community to come in and help my children.
Dr. Mimi, something that stood out during my conversation that I had in the past with Dr. Mark Perlmutter, who's an orthopedic surgeon who visited Gaza, was his description of the stark difference between what we witness on our phones and what the reality is on the ground. You mentioned just now that that awakening for you was what you saw on your phones and the genocide that we were live streaming. And it really hit me that he basically told me that we really can't experience and imagine the genocide just through our screens. So could you speak to your experiences firsthand, the firsthand experiences that you have, to really drive home to people what is going on the ground there?
Yeah, I mean, and it's absolutely true, and it's true for a lot of things, right? Pictures are important and powerful, but once you witness something as atrocious as what's going on firsthand, it's a very different experience, and it starts with the levels of destruction, and when you realize what's happening, the insidious nature of what's happening in Gaza, it's very it's distracting to see a child with their brains out of their skull, right? We see that day in and day out, and it has become almost, we're numb to it. We're seeing it on our phones, the most horrific things that you never thought imaginable, just like decapitation of heads of small children over and over again. It's not something that's natural to see, but then to experience it and see it firsthand is a completely different level. And that is the biggest distraction. We're seeing all of that, and it's very important, and of course, just carnage and horrible. But the things that you don't notice that are difficult and not tangible are how destroyed Gaza is. Um, Something that's not covered that much is the long-term nature of what's happening in Gaza. When you talk about malnourishment, for example, malnourishment in prenatal, in women that are pregnant, it's setting up a future for a completely destabilized population of children, and then chronic conditions in these children. You're not just having the acute malnutrition, but you're basically embedding it in the rest of society for the future. So even when these children coming from mothers suffering from severe malnourishment are being born into this, they're going to grow up to be probably not functional, to be able to do what a normal human adult can do, like you and I, to, for example, repair the state. If they ever get that opportunity, they won't be a normal, healthy person. And that's what the insidious part of all of this is, right? Even when you have hospitals, brick and mortar hospitals, you have a level of destruction that you can't really show on camera or in pictures.
Mhm.
For example, the agricultural land that's been destroyed. So the Israeli government, and along with the US government, have made it so that Gaza and the people of Gaza have to be completely reliant on aid coming in for food. They no longer can sustain themselves. The
Mhm.
land that's there is destroyed and completely contaminated with sewage, with heavy metals from the bombs. Who knows what's coming out of those buildings when they're completely destroyed, asbestos. And they're deliberately, we've seen footage of this, they have deliberately destroyed agricultural land so that it's almost impossible to grow your own food or to have your own livestock. And so this level of destruction is not something you really appreciate until you go
Mhm.
there. When you enter Gaza, it's an apocalyptic scene. Everything is destroyed,
Mhm.
complete rubble. So
Yeah.
to imagine, and if you think about agriculture, like just roads, a simple thing like roads, to get from one place to another is near impossible for people to travel. So if you just think of all of those things, and the electricity grid that's been completely destroyed, the water sanitation completely destroyed, it's hard to imagine rebuilding that.
Mhm.
And that's the part that I'm talking about, the insidious nature of this
Mhm.
destruction. That's so hard to know until you're there.
I just wanted to follow up on one point, which is that mentioning the difference between what we're witnessing on our phones versus what's going on the ground. We often scroll and we see these horrific images and videos. And the thing is, once we scroll, we're away from that. But the child that has that injury or burn or whatever that is, that's an ongoing thing for that. That's every second of every day. And so while we can just scroll and move away from it, these injuries and the trauma is something that they're basically stuck with 24/7.
Oh, absolutely. And and we there are these great stories, like for example, the little girl Mira, who, I took care of when I was there, and yes, we saved her life, but what about the ongoing care that's going to be needed afterwards? The things that she's suffering now, which is a repeated infection, not being able to have the rehab that she needs, and now her mother sustaining an injury that is debilitating for the rest of her life. So these are all things that even as physicians, when we go in and we're able to provide some medical care, there is that ongoing, that elephant in the room, that they're going to continue to suffer. You can save all those people, but you still have to have a functioning society. You still have to have basic things like electricity, fuel, clean water, those type of things. And not to mention stopping the bombardment and the airstrikes and the killing.
And you spoke correctly about the long-term consequences, but many people are unaware that the dire situation in Gaza, of course, predates the current war, with a long-standing hermetic siege in place on the strip. So could you paint a picture for our listeners to the medical landscape in Gaza, maybe even before the war, talking with other doctors there, and how it was impacted during the current genocide, the realities it faces now under the current blockade that has been imposed again on March 2nd?
Yeah, actually, I was just reading a One Health bulletin that was published last year, and there were 36 functioning hospitals in Gaza before this all started, and it was already too little for the population of 2.1 million. There was a shortage of beds still, as deemed by WHO. Since then, it has gone down. I mean, it's less than half, and those hospitals are not fully functioning. They're partially functioning, if at even at the most basic. Nasser Hospital, where I was stationed at the first time and part of the second time, was one of the most fully capable hospital. And I use that very loosely because it's not like the US where we have all of the resource that we need for the patients, clean water, electricity. No, these are hospitals that are just barely hanging on, but they still have something like a CT scan, like the only CT scan that's functioning in that south area, but still lacking things like gauze, food, enough food for the patients, but not even enough food for the locals, clean water, the medication. So there were times where there was not even enough pain medication or sedation, blood products to transfuse. The amount of contamination to the wounds as a result of this complete destruction is enormous in Gaza. So that's why a lot of these injuries too, for example, brain injuries or open head injuries, they're deemed to be unsalvageable because the rates of infection are so incredibly high that even if you did try to save it, it would be seen as like a waste of resources because the prognosis would be so poor. So these are things that are difficult to appreciate, unless you go and you witness them, but they're significant, they're substantial.
Yeah, thank you for listing that. I think speaking of those specific injuries, I wanted to say that something that gets missed when we talk about the bombings in Gaza is to sort of lump all of it as bombings and people getting injured and hurt, but we tend to miss the specifics of how people are getting injured and hurt. So I do think that discussing what type of injuries you predominantly see as someone who's been there, like you mentioned, and being an emergency physician, can help to understand the gravity of the brutality that we are witnessing. So, can you speak to some of the specific injuries that you see?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's overwhelmed with the bombardment and the airstrikes, right? Because that's the biggest and most atrocious thing that you're seeing. But the things that we aren't seeing are things like, for example, the conditions that are created because of this destruction, because this deliberate annihilation from the U.S. and the Israeli government. We had a patient when I was at Nasser that drowned because they were trying to get food. Similar things, they were trying to fish in the sea, and the current just basically took them and they drowned, and somebody found them, rescued them, but they came in and they were dead. And this is a condition created, right? This is and during December too, they would come in with hypothermia because they were trying to fish. They fell into the water, the current took over, and the waters are freezing at that time when I went in December, and they came in dead. But these were again conditions created because of the food blockade, of the aid blockade, no fuel. And so people were on top of things like broken refrigerators. I mean, there were images actually coming out from there. There were refrigerators that were maybe like not functioning, but they were using them as a boat, like a paddle boat, and they would fall off. And children, we would see children coming in because they drowned. I remember, we actually saw at Alexa a family that, a couple of boys that were trying to fix the sewage system because there's no sewage system. And so, there was an area of water. One of them fell in and drowned in the sewage. So yeah, this is not, a direct result of being hit by a bomb or, being shot by a sniper, but this is also created by that exact type of annihilation that's been going on, and that's deliberately induced, completely unnecessary.
Mhm. Yeah, and even I would say the injuries you just mentioned are also important for us to highlight, because people think it's just bombs being dropped aerially, but it's snipers, it's snipers targeting toddlers, which I've seen you talk about, and you and your colleagues share images and X-rays of that are of bullets lodged in the brains of these little children, and it's just really, really just eye-opening, quite shocking.
Yeah, I mean, and then the some of the articles that I've written for Palestine Chronicle too kind of outline those type of things that are not really getting attention. I just wrote an article called "Motherhood Stolen," and this was about a 29-year-old woman who had a small breast mass that could have been easily cured, easily resected, and she could have gotten chemotherapy before October 7th in Gaza. She could have been treated, but those life-saving medications and treatments were just not available. So instead of, she could have gone abroad. WHO approved her for evacuation, but she was denied by the Israeli government 4 times. She came into the hospital and bled out right in front of us, and with 3 small children. I mean, completely unnecessary. Curable, and any other condition would have been curable. So, and this is all because of the denial of healthcare and the destruction of healthcare. And again, yeah, it's not a bomb, it's not airstrike, but it's deadly. This is mortality.
Right.
And regarding this, beyond in your crucial medical work, you also experience Gaza not just through the lens of a doctor treating patients, but also as a mother and a woman witnessing families and other mothers and other women. And this transpires in every article you wrote for the Palestine Chronicle. So could you share some of these deeply human stories? Because I think it is very important to offer a glimpse into that side of Gaza, because for some reason it remains unseen in mainstream coverage.
Yeah, Romana, you're absolutely right. It's impossible to ignore for me, right? I mean, when you have small children, and I have to mention, as physicians, we're actually very used to compartmentalizing our work from our personal life, and we're good at it, especially in emergency medicine, where we see the worst of the worst. And I was trained, and I'm from Chicago, and so the trauma, the penetrating trauma, gunshot wounds, those are not foreign to me. I've seen that. I've seen pretty bad wounds as well, and injuries. But the level, the magnitude, and the population and pattern that we were seeing in Gaza is not something that you can prepare for. There is no profession that prepares you for that, because the amount of pediatric trauma that we saw is not natural. And then I can't help but think of my own children. The level of desperation and despair that the mothers feel in Gaza, I can't help but feel the same pain for them. And like you were asking before, it's one of the things that compels me to go back, and to keep helping, because just imagine if you're a mother there. I would knock on every door to ask for help for my children, because what can you do? What other thing could you do as a parent? And you're adding to it now malnourishment of these children, and once they are injured, it's so difficult for them to heal. So if they had shrapnel wounds and things like that, because there's no food. And so that malnourishment is preventing healing. And they sustain these injuries for so long because, there's no protein in the market. And again, that's another insidious way of just completely destroying these children. I mean, more than 50% of the population of Gaza are children. I always wonder, as a parent, how do you stay silent still? It's mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that experience, not just as a healthcare worker, but as a parent, as a mother. For me personally, every time my kids are sleeping and I pick them up, I have flashbacks of the scenes that I witnessed in Gaza, where the kids are in the arms of the parent, but they're actually dead. They're not sleeping, and it's really just so sad and horrific. And you just imagine, what if this were your kids? And so it's really important to have that as a parent, and that side of things. um, but speaking of healthcare workers, as you are one, nowhere is the threat to healthcare workers in worse than it is in Gaza. And the most recent merciless attack on those 15 Red Cross workers, where they were executed by Israel, and they were horrifically. There was also a cover up where the ambulance and the ambulance was buried, and they were buried, and then the investigation was done by the criminal entity who carried out this massacre, and that obviously didn't yield any punishment. But it just goes to show what type of impunity, excuse me, Israel is allowed to operate within. So just wanted to see if you had any comments on the assault on the healthcare workers. It's not just the patients, but on the doctor, the nurses, the all healthcare personnel.
Yeah, and this is exactly what I wrote about in many of those articles that you've published, is the level of impunity. It's unheard of to commit a crime and then to investigate your own crime. What kind of a world is, I don't even understand. It sounds comical. I mean, it really does. It sounds comical. If I commit a crime and then you put me in charge of investigating my own crime, is that not a conflict of interest? That doesn't make any
Mhm.
sense. And that's what's been happening for 18 months. I mean, every time there's a war crime committed, the Israeli government gets to investigate their own actions, and they come up with ridiculous, excuses. There is no way they could have not known that those were paramedics. It's
Yeah.
impossible. It's on video, right? The whole world
Mhm.
saw it. And they were dressed in uniform. There were siren, there was lights. I mean, there's just not. And being shot, the number of times each paramedic was shot, I think it was something like 20 times each. Uh, is that can't be crossfire? That's not a mistake, right? I mean, so it feels almost like being gaslit.
Mhm.
It does. It feels like the worst form of being gaslit, because just as a rational, intelligent person, this is impossible. What you're saying, just it doesn't make any sense. It's not truthful. Yet the Israeli government and now the US government just continues to put forward this rhetoric and push it in people's face as if this is the truth. And we all know this is not the truth, but they just get this level of impunity to continue to do what they're doing. And yeah, healthcare workers are targeted. If you are a healthcare worker, and unlike other conflicts where we have immunity, we are protected class. In Gaza, if you're a healthcare worker, if you're a journalist, which is completely contrary to Geneva Convention, we are targeted. We are targeted. We are hurt. We are the ones that should be afraid. When I was there, multiple journalists were killed, and that continues to
Mhm.
happen. The most journalists in any conflict combined in the past have been killed in Gaza, and that was a statistic put out by Brown University recently. And what do you conclude when you see something like that? You don't allow foreign journalists to conduct independent journalism, report on what's happening in Gaza, and then you try to kill all of the journalists that are reporting and showing the world what's happening in Gaza. What is the reason for that? Anybody with a small amount of rationality and intelligence can tell you what that means. You're trying to suppress the truth. You're trying to suppress what is actually happening in Gaza and your atrocious war crimes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And actually, in a recent discussion with Dr. Metz Gilbert, he actually said that being a healthcare professional in Gaza means that you are more at risk than a normal
Mhm.
person, according to official figures. This is totally insane. And, staying in the discussion with Metz Gilbert, we also spoke at length about the need to decolonize solidarity. He used that phrasing. So he seemed critical of various issues concerning how some international organizations operate in Gaza. In particular, he said that the field hospital strategy, in his view, often depletes local resources. So he said, despite having abundant money and resources, these temporary structures, and I quote here, do not belong to the native healthcare system and also use resources that should have been used to immediately repair, restore, and reopen the Palestinian hospitals and provide a decent salary to Gaza's medical professionals. Is this something you observed yourself, and how do you feel about this issue?
Yeah, and this point that's being brought up by Dr. Gilbert, it's a very important point. Did I witness this firsthand myself? No, I wasn't in the field hospitals, but I can tell you that this point of sustainability in healthcare is very important. You know, whenever there is global outreach or global humanitarian aid being provided, it's ideal to be able to empower the people, the locals, to sustain themselves. So in other words, not go in, provide the intervention, and then leave, and now they have no ability or no resources to do it on their own. That concept is extremely important worldwide. I mean, it's in most conflicts. The unfortunate nature of Gaza is it's unprecedented. It's so severely destroyed that even trying to do that, even if you did help build the already existing hospitals, there's so many things that need to still happen before it can fully function and actually provide meaningful care for patients. And the Israeli government is preventing that from happening. And of course, I'm sure there's room for improvement for the NGOs and the field hospitals, and I'm not an expert on that, so I won't even pretend to give you expertise. But what I can tell you is, you can build a brick and mortar hospital. You can even try to give them the medications and all of the resources, the physicians. But until you allow them to repair themselves, the water infrastructure, the electricity, give them the fuel that's needed, and repair the malnourishment that's been caused, it's going to be very difficult to restore that destruction. And like I was mentioning before, some of the things that haven't even been looked at are the level of contamination that the Israeli government has imposed. For example, the bombs that have been dropped, and the rubble that's been created and into the air that's been aerosolized, and also now buried into the ground. How is that going to affect the future? And we haven't even had an opportunity to uncover that. So that's another example of long-lasting destruction that's going to keep happening. Even if we had ceasefire tomorrow, there's still so much work that needs to be done. But to your point, I agree, Romana. I mean, there's a lot of empowerment and sustainability that needs to be implemented in Gaza. And it can't be, like the United States government likes to say, we want to just take it over. That's not the answer. The answer is to provide the resources that the people of Gaza need in order to repair themselves, because they are quite capable of doing so.
Absolutely. Dr. Mimi, we have now seen an increase in the ongoing genocide and escalation, as well as a starvation. We're entering the third month where no food and aid has been allowed into Gaza, complete siege. And in this situation, when we raise our voices here in the US, it's becoming a situation where we are now getting targeted more and more. Free speech within the US is getting targeted more against this Israeli genocide. Just as an example, I wanted to give to listeners here where I am in Texas, one of the cities in Texas, San Marcos, recently had a vote. In fact, it was just yesterday, where they had 4.4 million in funding that they wanted to keep local within the city for their own citizens. And instead, there was pressures to send it to Israel, which is where some of this money is going. And in the end, there was enough pressure from the state level to force them into a no on the ceasefire vote, hence to send that money, that $4 million to Israel. And so it's really a situation in which, for a foreign government, we are really criminalizing free speech and these basic freedoms. So you recently wrote an article for the Palestine Chronicle, which we'll link to. But I'm wondering if you can speak a bit on the situation where you mentioned the United States, once a beacon of free speech, has developed into a modern day McCarthyist state.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that was my most recent article, and it is frightening to me what this country has become in terms of free speech. That used to be that for us, that was the thing that we were most proud of, right? Free speech. Everybody knew the U.S. for free speech, and now people like myself and my colleagues are being, scared into being silent. Our licenses, our careers, our physical safety sometimes is being threatened because we are coming back and we are talking about what we saw. And at some point, yes, I understand that for practicality reasons you have to be careful, and what you say and who do you say it to. But at what point do you just get scared into being silent? I can't do it. And something I mentioned in my article is I will use every energy, every ounce of energy in my body to speak out against this. And I will not be silenced. I will not be scared into being silent, because the things that I have to say and the things that I witnessed and my colleagues witnessed are standalone statements. Shooting children in the head is wrong. Mass starvation of children is wrong. Blocking critical aid and medications to a mass population, to civilians, is wrong. There's nothing that comes after that. Those are full stop sentences. And if anyone wants to say, oh, but Hamas, or but October 7th, or you are a Hamas sympathizer, or you are anti-Semitic, it sounds ridiculous at this point. It doesn't even make sense. If I say shooting children in the head is wrong, you're going to call me anti-Semitic? That doesn't make sense. And I challenge people who are listening to not allow people to say that to you. Because at this point it's ridiculous, and we need to start challenging that, because common sense tells you that doesn't make sense. And we have to wake up every day and we have to look ourselves in the mirror. And after what we've witnessed, if we just allow this fear to silence us, personally, I can speak about myself. What good am I? I mean, and I've said this many times in interviews, what good am I? As a mother, as a humanitarian, as a physician, if I cannot try to stop this with every ounce of my being, then what good am I?
Absolutely. And we mentioned that even if this is indeed the world's first live stream genocide, and we see videos, as you said, it's on video, accountability seems frustratingly elusive. And many around the globe feel really helpless regarding this. But do you think there are tangible avenues through which ordinary individuals, organizations, and civil society can still make a meaningful difference in Gaza right now and potentially contribute to bringing an end to this devastating war?
Yeah, and I think right now when we look back at it, it seems like we haven't made any difference, and it's gotten worse. But I think that it's gotten global attention, and I think our voices together have become louder. And me of all people, because I feel so helpless at times, I feel that even though it seems futile at times, I think we have made a movement. When people go out into the streets and protest, when people speak up and continue to speak up for this and say that it's wrong despite trying to be silenced, I think it sets the tone for other people to be able to speak up. It's infectious, it's contagious. If I know that someone is in solidarity with the people of Gaza, then it gives me a little bit of bravery to also speak up and say something. And that by itself is extremely powerful. And I think that people underestimate the power of that. I could give you an example. Like on the plane, I was traveling recently, and I noticed a gentleman with a kufiya on and a little watermelon pin, and I immediately felt a bond to this person. I had no idea who this person was, and it gave me the bravery to speak to him and talk about it. And that conversation, led to another person getting involved and talking about it, and then another person, and we were waiting for our flight. So it demonstrates that if you have the bravery, like even a little bit, to do something like show solidarity or have a conversation, it empowers other people. The other thing is, and I said this already, but humanizing Palestinians is the key to this. The reason we are here today is because Palestinians have been completely and utterly dehumanized. When you dehumanize an entire population like that, you can do anything to them and you can get away with it. You can justify it in any way you want. You can justify shooting a small child in the head because you can say, oh, well, they'll grow up to be a terrorist anyway. And that, that's a true rhetoric. I've heard people say that. And unfortunately, it's because they are dehumanized. And what we need to continue to do with different avenues is continue to humanize Palestinians. Because that's what's brought us here. And there's so many ways to do it. Media isn't for everybody. You can write. You can. I've seen musicians and artists do beautiful things to amplify the voices from Gaza, to humanize the children of Palestine. And a big artist too, like Macklemore and things. I mean, they they're not politicians, they're not doctors like me who went in, but they still have a voice. And even the smallest person, the person that doesn't have a big platform, they can still do something. And it's just simply starts with educating yourself on what's happening and having a conversation. That is the smallest thing you can do.
Absolutely. It may sound rhetoric, but it's really humanity at its best. If we don't step up as human beings right now, I don't know where we should do that. So thank you very much, Omar, and thank you very much, Dr. Mimi, for taking the time to speak with us and for your courageous voice, for your unwavering dedication to justice in Palestine and around the world. And to all our viewers, we appreciate you tuning in. As many of you already know, the Palestine Chronicle is heavily censored on social media. And the best way to push back against censorship is to engage directly with our content. So please like, share, comment, and follow. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode of the FloodGate podcast. Thank you.
Thank you both.